And we're recording. So welcome everybody to what's going to be a wonderful conversation around a fairy tale, The Girl Without Hands. And this is sponsored by the Jung Association of Central Ohio. And I thought before I would introduce our panelists that it would be a good idea to cover a couple things related to Zoom for those who might not be as familiar with this this opportunity of using Zoom to meet as an organization. So I'll be the moderator for our program tonight. And you all should be muted at this point, with the exception of myself and Donice and Dick, just so that we can cut down on background noise. And Dawn does not want us to hear her dog, who's quite anxious in the background. So we'll make sure that she stays muted for a while. We are recording, as I mentioned, and so that recording, we'll be sending that out, probably the link will maybe go out through our newsletter, or if you are not on our newsletter, maybe you can just let me or Dawn know, Dawn Costin know, and we can make sure we send you the link to the recording if you'd like to have that afterwards. So a couple Zoom tips in case you're not comfortable with Zoom or you aren't familiar with it. So one of the ways to make sure you have a full screen, you can go to full screen at the top right, and you also can hit either speaker view or gallery view. Gallery view is where you see everybody's video screens, but speaker view, if you click on that, then you'll just see whoever is talking. So that's probably the best view that you want for this program, is to hit speaker view. Down to the lower left, on your bar at the bottom is, on the left is a microphone, and that's where you mute or unmute yourself. And then beside that is your video camera, so that's where you put your video camera on or off. And then, let's see, then there's some buttons for participants and for reactions, so you may want to be familiar with those in case at the end when we open up for questions, if you want to raise your hand, or if you want to type something into the chat, a question in the chat, you'll do that down, you'll click on chat, and a chat box will pop up and you can type your questions or comments in there. But we're going to try to, I've asked Virginia to be co-host of this meeting, and so we're going to try to unmute you and let you ask the question out loud if you'd like, or you can always submit a question via the chat. So those are some basic Zoom related issues. If you do have a technical issue that arises during the program, you might want to send a question or a comment in the chat, or send it directly privately to Virginia. If you go to the chat box, you can send a private message. Just find Virginia in the list of participants and type something to her, and she'll maybe be able to run some interference for you as it relates to technology questions or issues. Okay, so our format for this evening is we're going to do about 35 or 40 minutes of the panel discussion. So just imagine that we're up in front of you at Jung House or at another location, and we're having a conversation with the panelists, and then at a certain point we'd say, now we're going to open it up for questions. So we're going to do that the same way with this program. We're going to just move through sort of our conversation and dialogue, and then at a certain point, I'll open it up for questions or comments to all of you. Does that sound okay? You can even hit the thumbs up thing under reactions and like that, and then I'll know that you're good with that. Excellent. Look at you all participating. Awesome. So it's sort of the same as a live presentation. Look at those thumbs up. Great. Yeah, so again, welcome. And I want to introduce our two panelists to you today. These are expert panelists. We searched far and wide to find the people who talk about fairy tales the best, and we found the two best people. So first of all, Donice Wooster, for those of you who don't know her, she has had a really tremendous career in early childhood development, and has been a counselor to so many parents going through difficult times with children over the years. She's been a great friend of the Jung Association of Central Ohio, has served on the board, may have been board chair at one point. Were you board chair at one point, Donice? No, okay. And she's back on the board again. So Donice Wooster will be speaking today about fairy tales. She has a rich history in Jungian psychology, and so she can speak a lot to the some of the elements of the fairy tale we're going to talk about today. And then most of you know Dick Sweeney, who's our resident Jungian expert, and he's also a Zurich-trained Jungian analyst. He's also a licensed professional clinical counselor. He has a private practice in Cincinnati and here in Columbus. And so Dick is no stranger to the Jung Association of Central Ohio. In fact, I think he's the heart and the soul of the Jung Association of Central Ohio. So with that introduction, I want to start with our first question. I think this would be helpful for people. Dick, I'm going to pose this to you. We're talking about a fairy tale tonight, and fairy tales are ancient and old and mythic. What relevance do fairy tales have to our modern life, and how is there a framework for understanding how to interpret fairy tales?
Okay, sure. I'm happy to try to say a few things about that, and Donice might add some more later. But just to start, in general, fairy tales present the archetypal patterns or dynamics that happen in our lives as we encounter different types of situations. And every fairy tale presents a particular kind of situation and some of the dynamics that might unfold in that situation. And when it comes to sort of reflecting on or interpreting a fairy tale, we can look at it from different points of view. So for example, we can look at it from the point of view of masculine psychology, or that is to say, the dynamics, the issues that might be operative in the psyche and development of a man. And so in this tale, we might be looking at the father, we might be looking at the prince and the king, we might be looking at the gardener. We notice what moves are made by the male figures. Or of course, we can look at the fairy tale from the viewpoint of a woman and look at what are the basic dynamics that are unfolding in her particular process. What are the issues that she's confronting in her own development in this particular situation? Or thirdly, we can look at it from the point of view of a culture, and we might ask, how does what's going on in this tale reflect dynamics in a culture, situations in a culture, and how they play out, and how maybe they complicate the process or not. Now, I should say, especially in that aspect of looking at it from the viewpoint of what's going on in the culture, very often in a tale, we're looking at or juxtaposing masculine and feminine archetypal themes. In other words, we're looking at the themes that are commonly associated with men. That doesn't mean they're only in men, but they're oftentimes thought of as masculine aptitudes or qualities or traits. And we're also looking at those that are more customarily associated with women and might therefore be called the feminine. In some ways, they kind of correspond with yang and yin. Now, of course, all of these traits are in all of us, but in our Western culture, we sometimes attribute or associate certain ones more with men and women. So for example, we may be dealing with competition versus cooperation. Competition being thought of as more masculine, cooperation as more feminine. We might be looking at assertion as opposed to acceptance. We might be looking at things like productivity versus nurturance. And from a viewpoint of Jungian psychology, whenever one trait starts to dominate the opposite, that's when you run into trouble. And obviously, in this particular tale, we're going to see the wounding of a woman, wounding of the feminine by the dominance of a masculine attitude. So sometimes that shapes how we might look at a particular tale. I want to say just one more thing, and that is, at the beginning of every fairy tale, there is a problematic situation. In almost every tale at the start, something has gone awry. In this particular tale, what goes awry is the miller has grown more poor. And in the tale, we're told that his financial well-being declined by degrees. So he didn't start out that way, but somehow various factors have led him to lose economic well-being. I think there's a little bit of a hint in the film version of the tale where we notice that at the mill, the water has run dry. Now, how that might be interpreted is what we can talk about as we proceed. But in any case, in looking at a tale, we have this original situation where something has gone awry. Oftentimes, the initial response to that worsens the situation. And we very much see that in this tale, the girl without hands. So then the rest of the tale unfolds the various kind of movements that will need to be made for redemption and restoration to recur. And that's what we see very much in this tale. So just to start with the first part of that interpretation. So in this tale, The Girl Without Hands, the original situation is the miller has gone poor economically. He's in difficulty. We find him out in the woods chopping wood. And that's when he's approached by an old man who's variously defined in the Grimm's version of the tale as clearly named the devil. In this tale is sometimes referred to as an evil spirit. And we notice that throughout this tale, the evil spirit changes its guise at different points throughout the tale. So of course, the devil says, look, there's a way in which I can resolve this poverty for you. I can provide all the gold that you need. You don't have to chop this wood. So here's the Faustian bargain as it is. And all you have to do is sacrifice something. And I want what is behind the mill. All you have to do is give me that. And of course, as you know, the miller says, well, that's just the apple tree. Just the apple tree, not a problem. I'll give you that if you give me the wealth that I need. Now, of course, lo and behold, in effect, what he's doing is he's sacrificing nature in order to provide economic vitality. Once again, he's willing to sacrifice some part of nature itself, the apple tree, the fruit of nature. And unbeknownst to him at first, he's actually sacrificing much more than that. He's sacrificing his daughter. And the daughter, of course, we can also see as an aspect of his own feminine soul, which he's sacrificing in this process of turning against nature. So, as you know, he goes home and immediately now gold is flowing in the mill where there was no water before. He goes home, tells his wife, this is where all the gold is coming from. She realizes, oh my gosh, what you sacrifice is not just a tree, but our daughter, who was in the tree in this particular version of the story. In the Grimm's original tale, she's behind the tree, but nonetheless, she is to be sacrificed as well, and the devil will lay his claim in 3 years. Now, pretty quickly, not surprisingly, the wife and the mother protest that and say, we don't need all of this if we're going to lose our daughter. And in this particular version of the tale, it's particularly graphic. Shortly after that, the wife and the mother is killed by the attack of animals, seemingly dogs, that are an extension of the destructive energy of the evil spirit. And we can talk about how do we understand this operation of the devil or the evil spirit psychologically. In any case, in this tale, the mother is actually eliminated from the scene. And then, as you know, eventually the devil, the evil spirit, the old man comes to take his due. But at first he cannot get access to the daughter because she's been washing herself. In one scene, she's playing in a tree in water and she washes herself. And because she's washing herself, the devil says, I cannot take her. So he comes back the second time and he says to her, he says, he got the washing to stop, but when the devil comes back the second time, the maiden is crying on her hands. Her hands are wet. And the evil spirit, the devil says, I cannot take her because now her hands are still being washed clean. You must cut them off. And as you know, he then tells his daughter, much as he's reluctant to do it, not all that reluctant, he asks her to be willing to sacrifice his hands to save him. And she does have her hands cut off, but even then she's crying on the stumps of the hands and the devil cannot take her. So we noticed that it's the water, the washing, the tears that makes her unable to be taken over by the evil spirit, which is a rather revealing motif that we can say more about. But I think I just want to go that far with it. And now as we move over to the plight of the girl, the maiden, I'm going to toss that over to you, Donice, for some of your thoughts and to talk about that for a while.
Yes, so we'll follow her journey then from this violent act done upon her. And almost the first thing she does is to say, I cannot stay here. The father in his sorrow says, I will take care of you now. And she says, no, I need to walk. I need to leave. So in my view, this is a point of the story in which the forces of psyche, as represented by lots of the symbols in the fairy tale, and the forces of her own choices and bringing her own sort of volition to it, begin to interact and lead her on the path that she needs to follow, which is long and circuitous and takes a long time. So from this point, when she walks away from the mill, she has a journey. She has a first journey, which I'm just going to do an overview. A first journey, which then takes her to the castle. And then there will be a second journey after that that takes her to the place where her true growth takes place. And the journeys are quite different, I think. In this first journey, she's still dealing with how can I function with no hands. She's stumbling through the forest. She is falling and having a difficult time and is hungry. And her hunger really leads her to the edge of the river. And now the sort of beginning of, I think, the cooperation of the river and the water begins to support her and help her. And when she falls into the water, the spirit of the river lifts her up, as you may remember, blows a bubble of air so that she can breathe. But she has to say, I want to live. That is a question the river poses to her. And she has to say, yes, I want to live. And then the river supports her, helps her find a way to eat the pears in the garden. And the garden is quite magical looking, I think, as when she first discovers it. The colors and the, which reminds me, I wanted to say something about watching a fairy tale instead of hearing a fairy tale. For most of us, we've watched this movie, I've watched it several times, so that it is really giving us its visual language. My feeling is for young children anyway, and for growing children, it's more individual to hear fairy stories. Everyone has their own deep, dark forest and their own inner vision of what the story of a fairy tale might unfold. And so I think this is a different kind of situation to watch it rather than hear it and be able to bring our own imagination and vision to it. It's not bad, it's just different. It's a different way of doing it. So she finds her way to the garden. The river helps her find a way to eat the pear. And the gardener, this is where he first shows up, who is a very important character, I think, in this tale. He observes her and tells his master what he has seen. And the master the prince has also been watching and decides that he will find her. And they look and they find her on the ground and bring her into the castle. My sense is that the prince is at first drawn to her because she matches up with his own inner vision, his own anima. He says, oh, your hair is the color of barley. He's basically saying, you match up with something in me. So it's not so much about who she is, but how she matches something in him. Although he does say, you have come to me as you are, without hands, and invites her in. And she does need shelter, and she accepts that place. Dick, do you want to add anything to any of that?
Just a little bit, I think, what is it? It seems to me that the faux pas she makes at the beginning, of course, is deferring to the will of the father. She's presented as pure and innocent and all of that. But she also is deferentially giving her hands over to the father. And so her development has to take her away from there. And it begins, as you say, when she leaves the father's house. She realized this is no place for me. And then then she starts to follow her own longing. And to me, following the river spirit and following the waters, following her own longing, that becomes the direction for her. And she even eats more or less the forbidden fruit out of her own hunger. So now she's in touch with her own longing. She's in touch with her own hunger. She's following that. She's coming more into her own person. And of course, as you said, and the tale also says that she's believing that compassionate persons will take care of me, compassionate men in one version. So she still has a belief that there will be help for her. And that helps her quite a bit, that trust that help can be found. She finds it, of course, in the prince or the king. But then, of course, he, in one way, beneficently gives her hands. But of course, they're gold hands, the same color, the same shade as the gold that her father brought forth with his deal with the devil. And while it's a generous gift, of course, they're not her own hands. And that's what the rest of the tale will be about, her finding her own hands. And one of the turning points in the tale, I think, is, and it's different from the Grimm's original tale, is the point at which she says, "These hands are not good for me," and she throws them away. She even throws them into the river, and the river takes them away. So she's now gradually coming more into her own. But what do you see also in that, Donice?
Yes, and I think that the relationship between the girl and the prince has some validity and some companionship to it. They unite, they produce a child. And it's interesting that then he immediately has to go off to war. And I was struck in the movie by how I believe that as they have their, in a sense, wedding night or their first encounter, the images are of swords and soldiers on the screen. So there's still a bit of a masculine overtaking, I think, of that experience. And the gardener then functions as, when the prince goes away, as someone to watch, someone to care for her, to be aware of what's going on, to accompany her, in a sense, through pregnancy and birth, and nursing, and in a sense doesn't take care of her in the sense that he overtakes, but he, I think, accompanies her through this part of the journey.
And Donice, one of the things that you mentioned when we talked about this before was, and it's interesting that in the Grimm's brothers' tale, that role of the gardener is the role of is played by the prince's mother. So it's the girl's mother-in-law who is the one that cares for her and is the one that deals with the messages going back and forth and sends her on her way so that she doesn't get, so that she can't kill her. So, but it's interesting that in the movie version, they use the gardener. And Donice, when we talked about this before, you had some interesting ideas about that gardener. And I wish you'd share those, the earthiness and then the seeds as well.
Yeah, I feel as though the gardener is someone who does, in a sense, have a foot firmly on the earth and sort of a foot firmly in the river as well. But yeah, I was struck by the motif of the seeds. And I think it's true in some other fairy tales of the feminine journey that there's a part in which a feminine stepping away and waiting time has to include sorting of seeds, has to include discernment, really minute discernment. When he first gives her the seeds, when she's going to leave the castle, he says, these are for you to take. These are, I think he says, these are magic seeds, but they're all jumbled together in the little satchel. And when she does arrive at her place of hermitage, and she opens it and they're still all jumbled. And then the next time you see them, she has sorted them into their individual kinds. And she has figured out a way, despite having no hands, to plant them and to begin the growing and to sort of enter into a cycle of nurturing what can feed her and her child. So I think that the seeds are deeply important. Yeah.
Dick, what else would you add at this point?
If I might just jump in, I think one of the most challenging things psychologically to make sense out of in the tale, and yet it's significant, is the role of the evil spirit or the devil. You know, obviously some of this was written originally perhaps back in the 19th century. There's a lot of Christian overlay, especially in the Grimm's tale, where actually there's a maiden spirit that comes and helps her at times, and the focus on being pure and clean is very strong. But how do we understand the evil spirit or the devil? In my mind, the devil or the evil spirit represents the destructive component that's there potentially in the psyche of all of us. And certain situations may activate that destructive tendency, and we find it, and it can be caused by anger or fear or desperation or greed, and suddenly we're doing something that actually has destructive potential. And that's how the tale starts, that the desperation, shall we say, of the miller leads him to yield to the destructive energy that claims the tree and also his daughter and really his own feminine soul. But that keeps coming back into the tale because sometimes that destructive energy manifests instinctually in us as a visceral urge, and that's what we see with the animals. Sometimes the evil spirit is a pig with red eyes. You might say it's manifesting in the form of greed or desire. And if that functions completely from the unconscious, then it has the capacity to do destructive things. We have that curious situation then about when he has gone off to war, and now the messages get confused as they go back and forth. You know, the message that she has given birth to a son somehow gets distorted. In the tale, the evil spirit gets in there and changes it. Well, how do we understand that? And how do we, to me, the fact that when people are at a distance and when they're under stress, communication gets more difficult and our fears can distort things. You know, he wouldn't be the first father to fear that maybe his offspring wasn't going to be what he hoped it might be, shall we say. So that fear can distort what's being heard. And she has to be dealing with the fear of, is he really different from my father? Is he a violent man? He's off at war, for God's sake. He's not here with me. So at least in my mind, some of that fear, some of that anxiety can distort the messages that go back and forth. And suddenly they're relating to one another in ways they didn't know before. And by the end of the tale, they have to come back to rediscovering and re-meeting one another. So I do think that the role of understanding that phenomenon of the destructive energy is a crucial one. And that's the way in which it makes some sense to me.
And I think the movie does a very good job of showing how that destructive force can shapeshift. It shows up in so many different ways and in different forms, orally and visually. It is not something you can pin down and know it for what it is right away.
Yeah. There's one part toward the end of the tale when he's at war and the evil spirit takes the form of a black bird that's flying over the battle scene. And in the story, the prince says, somehow the sorcerer's blood seems to have gotten mixed with my own. And maybe he's falling prey to some of the paranoia, the distortion, the anger created in a war scene. Hard to say. But now that confuses the messages and leads to alienation between the two of them.
Right. At one point, Dick, it's not only the girl with no hands who goes through a transformation, the prince goes through a transformation too, as you mentioned when we talked about this in advance. Can you tell a little bit about that really interesting scene where he shows up at the miller's home, and he finds the miller has hung himself, and then what he does when he finds the hands of the girl.
Yeah. Yeah, I think it's a very important scene. So he's just come back from the war, from the conflict, the war which they lost, according to this tale. Might say in the Grimm's original version, it doesn't say he went to war, it just says he had to be away. In this version, he's away fighting. So when he comes back, first of all, he's very troubled when he finds out what has happened. He's moved to tears in the Grimm's version. So water, tears begin to flowing. It's the beginning of the development of greater empathy in him. Then he's thankful that the gardener did not carry out this mandate to kill the mother and daughter. He's grateful that he was not violent, that he didn't resort to violence. And then, as you say, Kathy, it's very interesting. He goes off back to her home territory. He wants to find out more about her. Now he wants to really get to know who she is, not just the anima figure that he thought she was. And then he gets more connected to the story of what happened. That's the place where, of course, they're at the mill. The father has now hung himself. And then there's that interesting scene where he goes to the stump and he picks up one of the pieces of bone from her hands and he eats it and swallows it. So he takes in and assimilates her own pain, her own suffering, and now his heart is moved by that. In the tale, at that moment, the water, the gold stops flowing gold and turns back into water. So now there's a restoration to true feeling, true emotion, true sadness, and the gold disappears. And I think that's the transformative moment for him. And now he goes on his lengthy search to find her and discover who she really is.
And I think at that same time begins to also follow the river. He dams up the mill water so that the river goes back to its natural course. He hears her song in the river and understands that's where he needs to follow. Yeah, all in that same moment. It's quite beautiful. Yeah.
So he follows the same river that she followed.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
To me, water is like the most important element in the whole, in terms of symbolism in the whole tale. Because when I watched it the second time, I noticed that when she goes up into the tree, the apple tree, the very first time, she's looking over an ocean. And then, of course, her tears are important. The spirit in the water saves her. She follows the water to the mouth of the river, and that's where she finds the place to go. So many, and there at one moment there's rain, water is throughout this whole tale.
Yeah, as long as anyone is in touch with the flow of true emotion, the destructive energies do not take them over. That's why the devil could not really take her over. But it's that flow of emotion that keeps the soul alive, and the destructive energies are not as likely to take over. So I think that's a strong theme. Do you want to, Donice, maybe talk about the hands symbol and what happens there, of course, toward the latter part of the tale?
Yes. Yeah. So as you watch her developments as she's living in the castle, she at first is frustrated caring for her baby without hands. She has to give up nursing, but she does begin to figure out some ways to care for the child and care for herself. And as the gardener helps her go off from the castle, he enables her to carry the baby, and she begins, and she does then, as you said, discard the gold hands, which she says are of no use to me, and finds her way back. And then we see as she plants the seeds with her tongue, as she figures out how to scrub the baby's blanket and diaper in the water with her hands, she learns gradually how to manage without her hands. But then interestingly, and this is quite different from the Grimm's tale, her hands come back as she is defending her son with the hatchet that has come from father to prince to her. And as she wields that to try to protect her son and herself, her son says, "Your hands." And he's the one just before she kills the prince who notices her hands are back, and that stops her and turns the situation again. In the Grimm tale, she's in the forest for 7 or 8 years with this sort of angelic figure, and it's really just the being in nature that the story says her hands just slowly grow back. There isn't a defining moment in the Grimm tale the way there is in this film.
Mhm.
Right.
Yeah, and I think that hatchet symbol is a very important symbol, because by the end of the tale, the instrument that did the wounding, that was the father's wounding, she has the hatchet in her own hands now, and she has the potential to kill the prince. She starts, but then she stops. And I would say her empathic regard and concern stops her from using a hatchet in the same way as her father. In that way, the father complex has been transformed. And she doesn't, let's say, treat every man as worthy of being hatcheted, or no person is trustworthy. So something is transformed, and it transforms in her hands, which I think is the real redemptive moment in the tale.
Right, right. There's someone mentioned in the chat a question that I just want to pose to both of you. It says, can you comment on the action where the gardener is the persona that's the go-between in the distorted communication between the girl and the prince?
Mm-hmm. Where the gardener is the persona?
That's what she says here, yes.
Uh-huh. Well, I don't know. There's different ways to think about that, I suppose. But if he's speaking for, I mean, that's part of the problem. If he is speaking for the girl, he ends up distorting the message because he can't really speak for her. If he's speaking for the prince, he can't really adequately speak for her. So as long as there's a, let's say, even the persona of appropriateness presenting the appropriate message, the real truth can't be conveyed. So I think that certainly is reflected in that. Donice, do you see anything more?
I just wanted to comment on, in the Grimm tale, a messenger is carrying these messages back and forth and keeps falling asleep so that
Right.
the evil spirit can switch the message. And so I think that's maybe a little clearer about just falling asleep to the situation, being unconscious, not paying the right kind of attention, is how those messages get garbled.
That's right.
It's less clear in the movie, I think, how those messages get garbled, except for the bird flying around.
Yeah, I think that's true. It's like when we go unconscious, the destructive energies can make themselves felt.
Mm-hmm.
Let me ask at this point, Dick and Donice, do you have some other thoughts you really wanted to comment on before we open up to our participation here with our 35 people that are with us?
No, I feel I've certainly said enough. I'd like to hear what other people are thinking.
I guess I just want to say one thing, because it struck me the third time through the movie today, that when they do reunite at the end, she's so clear about, well, I don't really know you anymore, but here you are, and here I am, and she's in a sense saying, this is what I want, so come, let's go. I think it's really important that he's saying, let's go back to the castle, and she's saying, no, we're not going back to the castle, we're not going back to the mill, we need to find a new place. And I also was struck, and then it's almost as though she and the child begin to fly away, and then he makes the decision to go and follow and be with them. But the third time I watched it, I thought, oh, it's kind of like a birth canal almost, that they're flying through. They're being reborn together as a new threesome, with a third thing coming out of everything that's developed. That just struck me this last time I watched it. So I think that's all I need to say. I think we should hear from some folks.
Yeah, it's good.
Okay, so the way we'll do that, if you'd like to, you can just type a question or comment in the chat, and Virginia and I will monitor that. Or you can somehow signal to us that you'd like us to unmute you, and we will try to find you in the list of participants, and or you can unmute yourself and pose a question, and we'd be happy to hear your comments or questions that way. And I know that Jungians are not shy, so I'm sure there'll be people who will speak up.
Kathy, this is Sydney. Can I ask a question?
Sure, Sydney, welcome.
Something I'm really puzzled about. The whole thing hinges on the hands. Why hands? Why not a foot? Why not an arm? Why the hands?
Well, at least in my view, you know, the hands are how we handle life, handle the world. It's how we take hold of things, grasp things. A lot of our initiative comes from our hands. So hands are the wherewithal we use to make contact with all of life, really. So obviously to sacrifice one's hands means one's giving up one's most natural point of contact with reality, it seems to me.
No, go to the participants window.
Anybody else?
Yeah,
Did you all have something? You're unmuted there, Linda Kernahan.
yeah.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah, go ahead.
Brian. So I had the intuition that the sort of the interaction between the father and the devil and the milieu where there was a lack of wealth, that represented the distortion of patriarchy and even throwing capitalism with commodification, where the natural flow, like water isn't just unconsciousness or feeling, but it may even be kind of like a natural flow like Tao, where it's like path of least resistance. And it's this artificial channeling into commodification of things, this unnaturalness that winds up being wounding, especially to women.
I think you can certainly see those dynamics in the Tao. You can certainly interpret that way. Water is the Tao, is the flow of life energy. And if that's being redirected toward, you know, financial prosperity, is that for which all else will be sacrificed. Yes, you can certainly see those dynamics in the Tao and the destructive outcome from that. I think it certainly lends itself to an interpretation like that. And there's not just one way to interpret the Tao, but I can see where you could see those themes there.
And the mother comments when she sees the gold flowing, but this is dirty. I mean, she sees right away that it's more of a negative force coming in.
Yeah. And Joe Hecker sent us a question in the chat. And this is interesting, Donice, because you commented on this when we had our pre-conversation. So I'd love to hear what you have to say about this. In the film, there was a lot of focus on the lactation, and the girl even nurses a baby animal, and at one point seems to wrap herself in a black bandage to suppress, you know, the milk flow. This was confusing to me. So Donice, you thought about this because we were talking about this earlier.
Yeah.
What thoughts do you have?
I have thought about it, and I don't know that I really have a final answer at all. It seems as though at the beginning, her lack of hands also makes it difficult for her to nurse the child. And I found myself a little bit troubled that the gardener stepped in and just gave the baby to someone else to nurse, although I think he was doing it out of sympathy for her and her difficulties. And you know, binding breasts is how they did stop milk supply at the time that this tale would have happened. But it's almost as though she had this beginning with her baby wasn't so much the place that she learned to trust her own maternal instincts and care for her child. That came a little later as she found her way to the hermitage and her life with that child and the freedom that gave her, that she began to claim as her own. it didn't come naturally at the beginning, as it often does not for parents, for mothers.
Right,
I-
right.
Mhm.
And also in
I'd
the
be glad to hear another idea about that, though.
yeah, and in the fairy tale itself, there's no comment, there's no talk about that part at all. That was just, you know, poetic license, I think, in the film, which is, you know, there's some beautiful scenes there.
Yeah.
Mhm.
And
Kath-
Brian, you had another thought again? You wanted to say something?
Yeah, I also noticed there was at that moment when there was the wet nurse and the binding of breast, there was also like a fleeting image of the Ephesian Artemis. The Artemis of Ephesus has like all these multiple breasts. I don't know if anybody
Oh,
else
right.
got a glimpse of that.
Mhm.
I don't
Yeah.
know what she means or what's special about that image.
I gotta say, I don't either.
Yeah.
I found that sort of mysterious. Yeah.
Yeah, and Julie in the chat said, could the suckling the animal have significance in terms of nurturing the instinctual nature? That's an interesting way of looking at when I think it's a little pig that's given to her to nurse. Is she nursing or nurturing her instincts?
Mm.
Yeah, makes sense that she needed to be nurtured herself or to begin to develop more of a connection with her own instinctive side.
Mhm.
And Linda and Brenda, do you want to, your hand is up, do you want to unmute and share your question?
Yes, one thought that I had about the nursing is that she needed to mother herself first before she could mother the child. And the other is that the mother initially was taking water to her daughter in the tree so that she could continue to bathe and purify herself. And I was really distressed when the mother was killed. But then I was thinking about it from a Jungian perspective and the fact that the daughter was quite naive and quite innocent, and that was like an imbalance. And when you think about the tension of the opposites, an opposite had to come in order to make an adjustment to that. And the mother was really enabling that. And so a counterforce had to prevail. But then when the girl went into the river and the river goddess lifted her up, I felt that was kind of like the amniotic waters, and that she was being rebirthed. That her mother was actually doing that in a more transformative way for her.
Mhm.
Yeah, I just wanted to comment on that. I think Brenda had a comment.
I had a different comment though. I'm stuck back on the near the end where her father kills himself. And so I was thinking that when he wanted all this gold, you know, the gold and everything, and then for some reason I went leaping somewhere else to King Midas and thinking about how he wanted gold and everything he touched is going to be gold, and how the greed on the one side and greed on the other side, it was a very unhappy place for them both to end up. And that's what I was thinking when I was thinking about the gold.
Mhm. Yeah, I think he ultimately loses his soul, and at the end, that's the condition.
It was greed.
Yeah. I think Catherine Berkman's trying to maybe make a comment. Kathy, if you could, no?
See, I don't
Yeah.
see that.
Can you hear me?
Yeah,
Yeah.
go ahead and yes, share, Catherine.
Now she's muted again.
Oh, unmute yourself, Catherine. There you go.
Muted again.
Catherine, if you could go down to the bottom of your screen and where it has mute and unmute, just so the red bar is there, just unmute yourself down there. While she's doing that, Sydney asked, could you comment on the time period this was written in any historical or political significance? Do we know any of that?
Unmute. Okay, did that do it?
Yes, there you are.
Okay, let me ask him, please. I've been wanting to.
Okay.
Richard, could you comment on the art of the film? I think it's very unusual, very different from anything I've ever seen. And what does that add to the story, and what's Jungian about it, or anything?
Well, that's a great question. I don't know that I'm the best person to respond to that. We have other people here with much more artistic knowledge and sensibility. Maybe you would have a comment. Maybe some others would have a comment on that. Certainly, it presents the development of the tale in very broad graphic strokes. I was certainly struck by that, but I'd be interested in other person's views about the art, the particular art of the film. I don't really know much about that.
Maybe Linda or Sydney could comment on that. Linda's the one who brought us the movie. She just was so moved by it. So Linda, you might have a comment about the movie itself and the art, and Sydney might be able to comment on that as well.
Yes, Kathy, I was really quite moved by the artistry of the movie, and I thought that the sketches were evocative. They called upon the imagination to fill in the outlines, the contours. We added the texture, bringing to the visualization our imagination. And so I think that it was captivating in a very kind of mystical, magical sense that made us sort of participants as it unfolded.
Could I add something? Was it Donice who said that when you listen to a fairy tale versus seeing a fairy tale, it's different? But however, the way the lines were drawn in this particular movie, you have to fill that in for yourself. So it's similar to when you listen to a fairy tale and you have to think about what does it mean, and you add certain things. This happens also when you see this, because you have to add your own imagination to finish it for yourself. So that brings a kind of similarity there.
Seemed very fluid to me too. Very watery.
Yeah, there's water again.
Yeah.
Right.
Sydney.
Someone else in the, oh, go ahead, Sydney. I want to hear what you have to say about that as well. Yes.
The art. I was just going to give a personal reflection. I thought it was just beautiful, just gorgeous to watch. And in terms of just, compared to other animations, it had this flow, but what I found so fascinating was that when a person moved across the screen, you could see through them to the mountain. It wasn't solid, it was transparent. So you were seeing through everything, and a bird would fly and you would lose them for a minute, and then they would come back. And in that way, they had this movement. It was just so gentle for such a story that was so tension filled, so talk about opposites.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Yes, absolutely.
Expression, Sydney.
And then someone asked if she is too pure for the evil spirit to touch her, why would the spirit think that not washing would make a difference? Any thoughts on that?
Well, maybe a couple of thoughts. Again, there is a lot of Christian overlay in this tale, and most of the Grimm's tales were published around 1812 or around that time. So, even the late medieval Christian outlook was still quite prevalent. And so it would be a very traditional Christian notion in one respect, that if you're pure and you're innocent, you cannot really fall prey to the devil. There's that notion. So the idea of washing in that respect would be consistent with that notion. But I think there's another way to look at it psychologically, that it's more the notion of staying connected to the flow of one's own natural feelings and emotions, when we're in relationship with that, the more destructive energies are not as likely to take over. It's interesting to me in the tale, we didn't mention this, but she names her son Sorrowful.
Yes.
So much of what flows through the tale and through her is sorrow. And the more there's a connection with sorrow, the destructive energies don't take over. When the king or the prince at the end now experiences the sorrow that his wife went through, now the destructive energies are at bay. The hatchet is not going to be used in the old way. So it seems to me that's a relevant way to look at it.
Here's another question in the chat, Dick, that I think is a good one for you to answer. I'm also curious to hear if there's a way to interpret the story as the inner life of one individual. For example, the father, the mother, the prince, the daughter, and the child, all parts of one psyche. Like a dream would be, for example.
Yeah, well, I mean, it certainly could be interpreted that way. It could be interpreted that way. I mean, you could take, let's say, from the point of view of a man who, let's say, is dealing from the get-go with a pretty demanding father complex, who expects him to do well in the world and to be successful and make money, let's say. And so he has a pretty critical axe-wielding father complex, giving him a hard time, which can alienate him from his own inner feminine. You know, the whole place of feeling, emotion, empathy, imagination, intuition is alienated, cut off, we might say. And so the tale is about his gradual coming to discover that on his own and get free from the world of the father complex. So he has to leave home. And I like what Donice pointed out, that by the end of the tale, there's no going back to the original situation. It's creating a new way of being, where the two of them are co-equal partners. So yeah, it certainly could be looked at from the viewpoint of one particular psyche.
And Linda Kernahan, you have your hand up again. Do you want to unmute yourself and let us know what's on your mind?
Yeah, this goes back to when we were talking about the visual aspect of it. I'm a musician, so I really noticed the movement of the visuals, and it was like there was a rhythm to it, and sometimes things would move and sometimes they wouldn't, and an object would become something else, and just the rate at which that changed and what caused it to change was really interesting. And there's also just one thing, I want to make sure everybody notices this. It was about 4 minutes into the movie when you first see the miller and he's chopping wood out in the forest. There's a log that he chops that actually looks like a hand.
Yes, yes. I saw that the second time I watched it. Oh,
I can find that. It was very disturbing. And then just one other quick little thing, and it's the same position that the log was in, but when she puts her hands out to have them cut off, I thought it was really interesting that they were up. Like, I mean, not that I would ever do this, but if I were going to put my hands out to have something horrible to them, I'd probably put them like this.
Yeah.
Like, that was interesting to me.
it was like an offering. She was sort of offering her hands to her father. She did not protest. She said, you're my father and I'll do what you asked me to do.
Oh, and just one other little thing. There were a couple scenes where there were these disembodied hands moving around. I noticed it was when she was being bathed and then again when she was giving birth. And I thought that was really interesting. Disembodied hands were doing things for her.
Yes, yes. T has a question. I'm curious about the triad of men in the girl's life, her father, the prince, and her son. I wonder if there's any significance in the fact that it's her son who notices that she has hands again, and also about the fact that there seems to be some visual and artistic parallels between the father and the prince. Is there some sort of progression from miller to prince to son? That's very insightful, T. I'm glad you pointed that out to us.
Mm-hmm. Well, it's a good point. Clearly, there's a progression from the father to the king, and the passing of the axe is a telling symbol of how they handle it differently. And of course, it eventually then passes into the hands of the girl without hands. And I would almost see the child as also part of her being able to cultivate the masculine in a healthy way now herself, that she had to develop her own masculine side or animus, so to speak, and then had the capacity to provide that to her son. So it seems to me that there's kind of a progression in the tale along those lines. But there's certainly different ways to look at it.
Donice, did you have something to add to that question? There's a couple more here I want to get to.
No, why don't you, no, go ahead with the other question.
Okay. Mary Marks, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question or make your comment?
Am I unmuted?
You are. There you are.
Hi, Dick.
Hi, Mary.
So there's a beautiful article by Terry Weinlein, and it's called The Wild Sanctuary and the Handless Maiden. I think she's artist, folklorist, tale writer. She does everything, beautiful blogs and websites. But so a few points in that I thought were interesting relating to the hands and the generative feature, creativity. So Clarissa Pinkola Estes is quoted in there saying in that blog that it has something to do with endurance, not without cessation, but to harden, make robust, or strengthen. And she says that this is the generative feature of the woman's long psychic life, and it is about creativity to make something. And then Midori said something about an invitation to sever old identities and crippling habits by journeying again and again into the forest. I think that part about the forest being the healing sanctuary and like the Asclepian temples from Greek mythology, all of that was talked about. But, and then von Franz about, she argues that the story reflects the way women cut off their own hands to live through powerful and creative men. So I thought that was very powerful.
Yeah,
So,
right.
Yeah, thank you. That's good.
Roger, do you want to ask your question? Roger Fortman has a question.
Sure. Yeah, in general, Grimm's fairy tales are very grim. So my question is, do they have to be so grim? I mean, why did her hands need to be cut off? Couldn't they have been paralyzed or something like that? Do they always have to be so bad?
Mm-hmm. Well, they certainly rely upon very powerful symbols, almost unmistakable symbols. So they're not subtle. And I think in general, the fairy tales are like that. They're not subtle at all. They're very graphic. They're very extreme. And they put the arresting symbols right front and center, with children being devoured and thrown into ovens and frequently the feminine being mistreated. Yeah, I think that's a way of graphically conveying the point.
Yeah, I think
Thank you.
they're just extremely distilled. Everything extra and detailed kind of falls away, and everything is distilled down to the absolute core of the situation and what's needed to resolve the situation. And I think that's what we respond to in a fairy tale. They're hopeful. As grim as they are, they say there is a way out of this. So.
And just to add, they're not about ambiguity, that's for sure. Usually what happens in the tale is the opposites have lost their balance. And so it is an extreme situation that produces extreme actions and symbols, I think.
Right. Well, I noticed that we are 10 minutes over, and of course there's no time limit on our going forward. So if people want to drop off, you certainly can, but if you want to stick around and continue to dialogue with Dick and Donice and ask questions, raise your hand or type in the chat, you're certainly free to do that. We don't have anything that's making us close shop at this point.
Can I make one more comment? From all this discussion and realizing from what you said, this was written like 1812 and with a strong religious background to it. I know this isn't very Jungian, but the word that hasn't been mentioned that's coming to mind right now is submission. And I think it came from the comment someone made about the girl putting the hands out with her hands up like an offering. And, you know, religiously, women are in submission to the husband, in this case, you know, the prince, the father, the, you know, and then there is hope at the end because she does. So maybe that's part of the historical context from back then. I don't know.
That's for sure. I would say, of course, at least in the world of the church, women submitting to a more masculine and patriarchal attitude is part of the story, of course, and elements of that are still with us. So yeah, you know, the subordination of the feminine to the masculine. Yeah.
And Linda, you have your hand up?
Yeah, that was me.
Oh, okay. Is it Brian? Is it Brian?
Brian, yeah.
Brian, yes.
So I guess it seems like that's always trouble whenever there's a, you know, like an overlord position of one function to another, that's automatically trouble. So it's part of the start of all that.
Yeah.
Which is kind of an aside, but so I noticed one thing that happened is when the girl with the child, you know, instead of following this man-made path, starts following the river, and it's meandering sort of way to its source, and then getting there goes to this hermitage, and then starts living there for years at a time. So then this boy is being raised, you know, without male influences, away from, you know, those symbols of war, you know, war making. It kind of reminded me of the portion of the Arthurian cycles of Percival being, you know, taken away by his mother to be raised away from all that. And in the end, the masculine's brought back in. But I just wonder, to me, it's almost like an illusion, and I don't know if that's a common theme or if that's even in the Grimm's version of this. But is that maybe like its own sort of content that it's alluding to?
Yeah, I think so. And I don't know if this is, I think this is along the lines of what you're suggesting, but there's an interesting detail in the Grimm's version of the tale that's not in the movie we watched, and that is when the king finally meets up with his wife and child. He lies on a couch or something, and they put a handkerchief over his face. And the handkerchief comes off, and then I think it's the wife tells the son, put the handkerchief back over his face, and it falls off, and they keep putting it over his face. And the son, sorrowful, says, how am I to know him as my father? My father is the heavenly Father. How do I know this wild man? So there's this whole motif of coming gradually to know the natural man, the earth man, the wild man that's not been at this point part of his upbringing yet. So it's an interesting motif that I think is related to what you're pointing to.
I wanted to say, I'm glad you mentioned the path, because I was very struck by the imagery of that. When she leaves the castle, the road that the prince had ridden down to go to war is lined really with masculine statues. You know, it's a paved road, it's lined with statues of men. And then she sees this little path that goes off into the woods and wisely takes that, and that's a crucial decision point there. And when the prince first leaves the castle to find her, he just gallops right past it. And so he still has a lot of learning and searching to do before he understands that he needs to follow the river as well. But I thought that imagery was quite striking.
Yeah.
Okay, little lull there. So that makes me think that maybe people feel complete. This has been just an absolutely wonderful conversation. And Dick and Donice, do you have any final thoughts do you want to say before we close at all?
I don't think so. I just appreciate the responses and comments of everyone who's involved tonight. That added a lot to it for me.
Absolutely, I would agree. Yeah, a lovely discussion. Thank you.
So thanks to everyone for participating, and to Dick and Donice for your insights, to everybody's questions and comments. They were really wonderful. What a great program. And so we have recorded it. We will make it available. Please feel free to share it with others that you, maybe you can tell them about the movie and then have them watch this so they can understand what they just saw. So thanks everyone so much. We really appreciate you being here. And stay tuned because the Jung Association is not done providing wonderful educational programs for you. So thanks everyone and good night. Have a great weekend.
Good night.
Good night.
Thanks.
Good night.
Thank you all.
Lots of thank yous and kudos are coming through the chats for Dick and Donice.
Great. Thank you.
Thanks.
Mhm.
Okay, I will, I just stopped recording. And so I'm going to end the meeting for all, but thank you to the three of you for helping out so much. Really, really appreciate it.
Thank you, Kathy.
Thank
Yep.
you, Kathy.
Thank you. Thanks for including me.
Oh, glad you could be here.
Great. Great.